I suppose I was probably, I don't know, 8, 9, somewhere in there, years old, and I came out of church. Didn't like to go to church as a kid. My dad would dress me up in this ridiculous suit, had it wear to church every Sunday, and felt like a monkey, all dressed up. And I came out of service one day, and this lady came up to me, and she said, "Someday you're going to be a great pastor." And I about threw up in my mouth. I just thought that is the most awful thing that somebody could ever say to a poor kid who, that was the last thing in the world that I ever wanted to be. Why would I want to be the guy who stands up in front every Sunday and bores all the kids to death? Why would I want to be the guy who, was just the most awful thing. Well, 10 years later, 9 years later, however long it was, when I turned 18, I got saved. And so I was very excited about Jesus. I was very excited about following Jesus. And yet, if you would ask me, "Hey, Mike, what do you want to be with your life?" I would have told you I would want to be an architect. And that was my plan, to be an architect. And so it wasn't on my radar, wasn't thinking ministry really. And even after I went into the ministry and traveled with my parents for a while, I had no desire whatsoever, especially after that. Traveling from church to church, and we visited dozens of churches. I'm not sure how many, but dozens of churches. And I never got the idea that what the pastor at those churches did on a daily basis or a weekly basis was anything I wanted any part of. Now, what I was doing when I was traveling with my parents was very exciting. God was moving. The Spirit would do cool things, and miracles were taking place. And so I was very excited about that. And I knew, as I traveled with my parents, I knew that, man, there is nothing I want to do in life other than serve the Lord. That's just, I was spoiled for anything else. I just couldn't see myself, being an architect really necessarily or whatever, but I really wanted to serve the Lord. And maybe He would use me to do architecture. But the Lord spoke to me. I was in New Jersey. I remember it very vividly. I was in New Jersey, and I was in my Aunt Franny's den, where they had a hide-a-bed, and that was my camp out. And I remember just there in her, sitting on the hide-a-bed and just praying, and I was overwhelmed by the power of God, just kind of a baptism of the Holy Spirit, if you will. I had no idea what was happening to me, but I was very, very just overcome by the Spirit of God. And I couldn't describe. I have no idea what was happening, but I just heard the Lord speak to me so clearly, and said, "You're going to be a pastor." Well, this was not necessarily good news to me. I was not like, "Oh, great, that's awesome. That's all what I always wanted to do." In fact, I was like, "You know what? If that's what God wants to do," and this is kind of the deal I made with God, it can't be boring, which by the grace of God it never has been. And I can't do this. This is your problem, because here I am, this kid who I couldn't read out loud because I was self-conscious. Anyway, so over the next 9 years, probably again, as the Lord spoke that into my life, and then I just started getting this desire for the Word of God. And so I started reading the Word of God. I started getting this desire to witness to my friends who were all LDS, and so I started studying books on the Mormon Church, and so just kind of preparing myself in those ways. And I got plugged into a church, which was Calvary Chapel of Pocatello. But then God began to prepare me in ways I didn't expect. The first thing I did was I got this job. He gave me these jobs, and I'd witness to people and stuff, but he got this job as basically a guy who did market research. It's called Burnett Research. And in that job, this was super fun. You can imagine. I got to sit in front of a computer screen and try to get people to do surveys with me on the phone for a half an hour. I feel horrible for those poor people that have to do that. But I have to read these screen after screen after screen. And I was a self-conscious reader, so I stumbled over my words, dyslexic and all that. And yet, through that job, even though it was miserable, God taught me how to be comfortable reading out loud in front of people. And then, I got a really good job from Amalgamated Sugar, and I was stacking beets for a while, which was kind of fun. Can't beat that. And while I was doing that, I got a witness to a bunch of guys, and really neat to see God working. And some of the guys, even on that group, got saved and stuff. And so it was really exciting to be a part of that. And then when that job was over, I ended up, we ended up having to move to Boise. And so we moved to Boise, and looking for work. I got a job at Boise Cascade for a while, but then I injured myself. And so I saw this job for manager position of a phone room. And I was like, well, I've been in a phone room. Maybe I could be a manager phone room. I had no managerial experience at all, was not skilled to do that. And very kind of shy, passive, not a guy that could stand in front of a crowd. Was very, very nervous about stuff like that. And so I got this job at Olin Mills, and for some reason, at this Olin Mills job where I'm calling people and asking them if they want to buy a club plan, and I found out that I was in this room full of about 6 other people who were all going for the manager position. And whoever got the highest sales was going to be the new manager. Well, for whatever reason, I could sell the heck out of that club plan. It had to have been the Lord, but just like every call. And so I got the highest sales in the whole room, but there was another guy named Steve, and he did really well as well, but he had a ton of managerial experience. And so they said, you did really good, but Steve's kind of more qualified, so we're going to give the job to him. And I was kind of bummed, and they said, we'd like to keep you on because our Nampa store is going to need a manager. So anyway, I stayed on, and sure enough, they fired the Nampa store manager. They wanted to hire me, but I had to stay there for about another month. And so during that month, Steve, the guy who got hired before me, taught me how to be a manager. He taught me how to hire and fire. He taught me how to train employees, how to motivate people, how to, all those things, all the things you need to know as a manager. He just gave me a crash course in it, which was awesome because I would have had no idea what I was doing. And so I had Steve. He did that for me. Lord used me to lead him to the Lord. And so then I end up in Nampa doing this managerial job, and so it was okay. It was a good gig. I had about 6 employees that I worked with and trained and hired people and witnessed to them, and a lady got saved there too. That was exciting. And so that job, and then one day I was driving home, and it was late. I worked evenings, and so I was driving home, and I was tired. And I remember I'm driving home, and I could see the Mormon temple. Now, you've all seen the Mormon temple in Boise, right? Well, I'd seen it one too many times, all lit up. And I was just like, ugh. And I said, Lord, I don't want to drive home one more time and see that stinking thing all lit up. And at the moment I prayed that, now it was just kind of a half-hearted prayer, but the moment I prayed that, I knew right then the Lord just answered that prayer. What did I just pray for? I drove to work the next day. I sat down at my desk. I was getting ready. I was watching the clock, getting ready to start my shift. My employees were all gathering around, sitting at their cubicles. And I turned around and I said, okay, time to start. And my boss was standing in the door. And he said, we're closing the store. We're consolidating because basically, remember when they opened up the LATA and everybody could call from Nampa to Boise for free. It didn't cost money to call from Nampa to Boise anymore. And he says, we don't need 2 phone room stores. So you'll probably be able to get the job in Boise. But I was like, what did I do? And so I drove home in the light that day. Didn't get to see that temple all lit up. It's crazy how God answers prayers sometimes, or how he causes us to pray, weird things like that. Well, now I needed a job, and I really didn't want to go back into phone work. I liked the manager thing a lot better. But, the only thing that was really available at the time was a phone job at Sterner & Klein. So how many of you guys have worked at Sterner & Klein? Anybody? Okay. Well, a lot of people have. Anyway, in over the years, I met a lot of people who've worked there because they just have huge turnover. And so I got there, and I was on the phone, and I remember sitting through the training thinking, this is the most awful thing I've ever sat through in my life. This is so boring. And I thought, this is what I need to do here, is do the trainings. And so got there, started working, had a really bad attitude. I was kind of mad at God that I had that job because I just, I'm not mad at God, but just kind of like irritated. God, why would you make me pray that, or let me pray that, I don't know. But anyway, so I probably wasn't the best employee, but I did my job, and for some reason, I couldn't pick up the phone without getting high ratings. Whatever, I got really good ratings on my phone calls. And from there, a lady that I befriended that was from Pocatello, where I was from, she got promoted to training manager, and she said, I want Pokey. She called me Pokey because I was from Pocatello. So I want Pokey to come and be on my team. And so I got to be on her team. And when the Lord did that for me, even though I hadn't been the best employee, when the Lord did that for me, I thought, you know what? I've been promoted, and I didn't deserve it. And so I'm going to do my best. And so I worked really hard for her. And then she got moved to the office, and I was made the training manager. And so now I was training 6 or 8 people at a time, 10 people sometimes if it was a big hire. But then the company expanded, and the next thing you know, I'm standing in front of 40 and 50 people at a time. And I redid their training. I put it into PowerPoint. It used to just be, kind of a boring, long thing, but I made it exciting, put a lot of humor into it. I'm okay at doing that. And after a while, just doing that, I got used to speaking in front of people. And then Calvary Boise, Pastor Bob asked me if I teach a class on witnessing to Mormons. And so then he gave me that pulpit that I used to have up here. And so I stand behind that pulpit and teach this class to about 40 or 50, 60 people in the Mormonism class. And just little by little, the Lord began to give me the skills to do what I do now. Just a little bit at a time. Learning to be a manager, learning to train, learning to stand in front of people and not be nervous, learning to teach a class in front of people, and then ultimately, becoming an intern at Calvary Boise. And then, when we ran the children's ministry over there for a while, that was part of it too. But just all these experiences, and little by little, God snuck up on me, is what happened. God snuck up on me, and the next thing you know, I've been trained to stand up in front of a crowd of people. And during that whole time studying the Bible, as much as I could, teaching home Bible studies during that time, all those things to prepare me. And yet, that's what God does with our lives. And I think specifically, if we're willing and we're able to say, God, I want to do whatever you want me to do. And show me where you want me to go. Now, I had no idea when that lady said to me, coming out of church, someday you're going to be a pastor. I had no idea that would ever come true. In fact, I hoped that it wouldn't. Because what a terrifying thing to have to stand in front of people and cry all the time, like my pastor did. I didn't want to do that. Thank the Lord I didn't get that part of it. But no offense to Jason, because he's a great teacher. But just not my thing, right? And so, God just prepares us. Now, when we think of the life of Joseph, and that's where we're at in Genesis chapter 41, we think of the life of Joseph, and God was doing the same thing for him. And I love Keith Green wrote a song, and it's called Trials Turn to Gold. And one of the lines in that song is, you've brought me low so I could know the way to reach the heights, to forsake my dreams, my self-esteem, and give up all my rights. For each one that I lay down, a jewel's placed in my crown. For his love and things above are all I'll ever need. And how true is that when it comes to Joseph? I mean, here's a kid who was just a hubris in his life. The idea that he was the favored son with his Technicolor dream coat, and he had all this promise of being probably the most prized and the most awarded son in all of Israel, who was favored by his father. But then his brothers would take him and throw him into a pit. They would sell him to the Ishmaelites as they came by. He would get sold into slavery, humbled completely. And then, even though a slave rose to the top and was the highest in the house of Potiphar, until Potiphar's wife, of course, cast longing eyes on him and said, Joseph, lie with me. And basically said, when Joseph refused for the last time, that Joseph tried to rape her. And, of course, that led to Potiphar, the captain of the guard, having to put Joseph into the prison. Now, we assume that Potiphar knew the character of his wife, and that's why he didn't have Joseph killed. So he puts him into the prison, and there Joseph is rotting in prison. Now, this whole episode in Egypt was at least 13 years. 13 years. We don't know how long, 11 to 12 years he was in prison, a long time in prison. And then, of course, one day, the fateful day, he's in prison. He's head of all the prisoners because that's what God elevated him wherever he was. Remember, he was the honor prisoner. My son is an honor prisoner in Egypt prison, you know. And he's the honor prisoner, and he's the one who's kind of in charge of all the prisoners. And then one day, the chief butler, the chief baker, they come into the prison, and he is put in charge of them. Now, for whatever reason, the day came while they were there, and they were there for some time. The day came when he noticed that their sadness was greater than the normal sadness, right? I mean, they're already sad because they're in prison. They don't know what Pharaoh's going to do to them, but he comes and both of them are more sad than normal. He noticed that they were sad, and so he says, "Why are you sad?" And just shows his heart. Here he is, wrongly accused, sold into slavery. All these bad things have happened to him, and he still cares about the guys who are in prison. You'd think that he'd hate those aristocratic jerks that were, faring high in the Egyptian culture, and here he is, rotting in prison innocently, and yet he still cares about them. And he says, "What's troubling you?" And they said, "We both had dreams." And of course, the chief baker had this dream of grapevines, 3 grapevines, and he's squeezing grapes into the cups of the Pharaoh, and then the Pharaoh drank the cup, and he said, "Well, your dream is this: in 3 days, your head will be lifted up, and you'll be restored to your position, and you'll hold the cup of Pharaoh as before. You'll be his butler again." And then the chief baker saw that, hey, that's a favorable interpretation. I want to see how I do. And so he says, "Hey, I also had a dream. And in my dream, there was 3 baskets on my head, and there was all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh in the top basket, and the birds of the air came and ate all the fruit or all the bread out of the basket." And he says, "This is the interpretation of the dream. In 3 days, your head is going to be lifted up off of your body, and you'll be stuck to a tree, and you're basically going to be killed." And so he saw that his interpretation wasn't so favorable. But anyway, Joseph said to the chief butler, "Hey, remember me when you're restored to your position." And what did the guy do? He divinely forgot. He divinely, by God's design, by God's providence, he forgot. And he goes back to his position, and Joseph, you can imagine the anguish of that. Sitting in there, why am I here? What have I done? What have I done, God, to deserve this? He had to be thinking. And here he is sitting in the prison, and no doubt, the day after he interpreted that dream, when the day the guy went back to be with Pharaoh, he thought, "Man, surely tomorrow is the day I'm getting out. Okay, maybe it takes a little longer to process the paperwork. Okay, probably next week. Could it be a month before I get out?" And how long goes by? It says in verse 1, "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by a river." Now, 2 full years. And by that time, Joseph must have thought, "Hey, I've been forgotten. I've been wronged. I've been cheated. That scoundrel." Who knows what he thought, but he must have thought, "Man, there's no way I'm not going to get out of here." And so it says, verse 2, "Suddenly there came up out of the river," so the Pharaoh's having a dream, "suddenly came out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and they stood by the other cows at the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke." And so Pharaoh's having a dream. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever had a weird dream, that really bothered you. One of those dreams that's just like really creepy or weird, but you just get a picture of this. First of all, the Egyptians worshipped the cow. They worshipped the god Apis, which was Apis, so I can't remember the other name of the Horus. Maybe I can't remember what the name of the other name for it. But anyway, this worship the cows, and so he's seeing this dream, and he's probably thinking, "Oh, this is a divine dream." And so he sees these cows, and they come up out of the river, which is not normal, right? Cows don't usually come up out of the river. But they come up out of the river, and they start grazing, and they're nice, plump, fat cows, good cows like you like to see. But then he sees these gaunt cows. Now, the idea is skin and bones, just nasty looking, completely emaciated, gross looking skin and bone cows that come up out of the river. And then the Hebrew is they chew up the other cows. Now, can you imagine this? It just says ate. They ate up. But it means to chew. And so you can imagine these skinny, gaunt, nasty cows starting to take bites out of these giant cows and just chewing them up and eating them. And then after they're done eating, they're still gaunt and yucky. It says, verse 5, so he falls asleep again. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up out of the stalk, plump and good. And then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh woke, and indeed it was a dream. So this one, he's not quite as scary, probably, but definitely impacting him. Verse 8, it says, now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. And the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. And so it was normal, when you had a dream, and the Egyptians were very into dreams. We see that in a lot of their hieroglyphics. They talk about interpreting of dreams and all that. And so he would have this dream. It troubled him. So, of course, he calls the guys. And again, these guys, we see it in Nebuchadnezzar's court, that these guys are usually just kind of charlatans. They really make things up. And remember, when Nebuchadnezzar had a troubling dream, he says, I don't want you to give me the interpretation of the dream. I want you to tell me the dream and give me the interpretation. And of course, nobody could do it. And he says, I don't want a bunch of liars just telling me what they think it means. And so Nebuchadnezzar was wise enough to say, hey, I want to know the dream and its interpretation. And Daniel and his buddies went into a prayer meeting, and God gave him the dream and the interpretation. So it was supernatural. At this time, he just has his dream, and he trusts his guys enough to tell them the dream, and they're trustworthy enough, notice that they don't just make something up. They don't know what it is. And so, obviously a significant dream, but then, notice this, it says the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. Now, there's probably 2 parts to that. First of all, he remembers what got him thrown in prison a long time ago. I remember my faults this day. He's not blaming it on Pharaoh, because he's about to talk about, remember when you were mad at me, you threw me in prison. In fact, let's read that. It says, verse 10, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream one night, and he and each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. And so he's saying, I remember my faults. When you put me in jail, he's kind of owning it. You don't just say, remember when you falsely accused me? Probably not a good thing to say to Pharaoh, right? And so he says, I remember my faults when you were angry with me and I was put in jail. But he's also notice he says faults. You put me in jail because of my fault, and then I forgot this poor guy, which seems to be the next thing. He says, now there was this young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. And so he says, exactly what he said was going to happen. That's what happened. So then it says, verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and shaved and changed his clothes and came to Pharaoh. Now, you have to understand, and you've probably seen the movies, Egyptians weren't real big on hair on men. And so they would have shaved his head, they would have shaved his beard. They thought of hair as dirty on men. And so they basically put mascara on him, and they probably would have made him look like an Egyptian. Now, to Hebrews, they didn't shave their beards, and they kind of had big beards. So no doubt Joseph, who knows how long he's been in the prison, probably years and years and years, a decade or more, and he probably is just rocking this beard, and they come out and just shave it all off. And of course he probably needed a pretty good bath because, I don't think that prisoners in Egypt in those days probably smelt really great, just guessing, right? Even in Paul's day, they talk about the Mamertine prison that Paul was put in Rome, and basically what that was is a hole in the ground that they would have dropped him into, and he would have sat there in his own waste, in the waste of other prisoners. These are the places that Paul would have been when he said, this light affliction that is but for a moment. These are the places that Paul would have told us to rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice, when he's going through turmoil like that. But Joseph, he's brought out, and he's given a shave and a bath, and clothed, and brought to Pharaoh. And it says, verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Now notice this. Now, this is really interesting, because you can imagine Pharaoh was the most powerful man, if not the world, in all of Egypt. He is nobody to be reckoned with. If you stand before Pharaoh with any type of offense, he could have your head, in a second. It's interesting. Chuck Colson in his writings, his Christian writings, he talked about his time when he was in the White House with Nixon. He was kind of one of his chief advisors. And if somebody would come in to complain, wanted to talk to the president, he'd bring them they'd come in to complain or come in to have a voice with the president. He said that they would be in this waiting room, and he'd let them sit there for a long time. And it's a very imposing room, with lots of books and pictures of presidents and things. And then he would walk them through this hallway that had pictures of the presidents throughout the ages in action. There was all these pictures of the presidents, giving speeches or, commanding things. And then he would walk them by, and he would say, this is the situation room. And of course they're probably thinking of, generals and the president. Actually, that happened at the Pentagon, but, they would think about these generals and everything sitting in this room making decisions whether they were going to launch the bombs, right? And then he would take them into this big hallway, and there was this giant gallery, and it was very, very impressive and very, very opulent. And then they would take them outside the Oval Office where there was guards standing, and of course there's guards everywhere, but now there's the serious guards who are standing in front of the Oval Office with their little microphones and their guns on them and everything. And then somebody would go in and ask Mr. President if he could come out for a minute to talk to these men. Or they would be invited into the Oval Office. And as they were brought into the Oval Office, he said it was all on purpose, because these people would come in to talk to the president, and he says, and the lions of the waiting room became the lambs of the Oval Office as they stood there. And he says all their beefs and all of their arguments, they were very polite. Nobody ever, talked down the president, because it was all meant to impress. And no doubt it was the same thing as Joseph is brought in before the Pharaoh. There would have been guards, there would have been, protocols, and being shaved and changed and told what if you go in before the president, you're not allowed to do this, you're only allowed to do that, you can't speak unless you're spoken to, all these etiquette things. And no doubt that all those things were in place there in Egypt as Joseph goes before Pharaoh. It's very imposing. The throne is way up here. Pharaoh's way down here. He's probably surrounded, Joseph is way down here, and he's probably surrounded by all these guards who, at the slightest offense, could usher him out or even kill him on the spot. And so he's standing in that position before Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, hey, I've heard that you're the guy who can interpret dreams. And Joseph answered the Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. Isn't that wild? It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I love this. We talked about this in devotions this morning with staff. And that is the fact that it doesn't matter who we are. If we're being used of God, if we're in a position to where we're doing something super important for the Lord, like cleaning the church or something, or, watching kids, or leading worship, or something small like giving a message, It doesn't matter what we do, we have to realize that the power is not of us. It's of Him. And we have this treasure, the Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 4, I think 6. We have this treasure in earthen vessels, jars of clay, right? That we might know that the power is of God and not of us. The biggest mistake that we can make as Christians is to think that we have anything to offer. Or that any moment that God could not take us and replace us with somebody else and work more mightily through them. And that's the problem. If we ever begin to think that we are something when we are not, we are nothing. But if we ever begin to think that we are something, it renders us ineffective. Because Jesus said what? Without me you can do nothing. That God's power might work in us. I was reading Howard Hendricks' book, Living by the Book, and he was talking about how he went to speak at a church one time. And he says it was always his least favorite part of the sermon. He says it was the glorification of the worm. He says that happens after every sermon. There's what they call the glorification of the worm. As the pastor stands at the back and people come up and say, "Oh, Pastor, that was such a good lesson. Oh, you really spoke to me today. I just felt, man, you're just such a great teacher. You're so wonderful," or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, It's the glorification of the worm. One thing I always listen for, when people come, out of a service, I love it when people say, "God spoke to me," or "God touched me today." Especially that, because that might have been during the worship time, or it could have just been somebody speaking to them, or, maybe it was the message, but it doesn't matter. People say, "Oh, Pastor, great job." I already knew that. The devil told me on the way down, right? The devil told me, "Yeah, you did a really good job today. You should be proud of yourself. Wow, good job, Pastor." Right? Because it's not about us. And the second we begin to think that it is about us, the second we fall hard, right? And I love what Joseph says here. He says, "It's not in me." It's not me that can interpret dreams, but God. He gives all credit to God. Now we have to be careful. That's one of the hardest things, and honestly, I appreciate it when people just say, "God bless you, Pastor," on the way out, and not, "Oh, great job, Pastor," because what are you to say? I can say thank you, but then it's like I'm taking the credit, right? And some people will really feel that way. I just don't know what to say, and so I say, "Okay, thank you," and then people look at me like, "Well, aren't you full of yourself?" And then I heard Gail Irwin say one time, somebody came up to him and said, "Oh, great job, Pastor," and he said that it was somebody else. I'm sure it was probably him, but anyway, he says it's somebody else. "Great job, Pastor." "Oh, it's not me, it's the Lord." And the lady says, "Oh, it wasn't that good." Right? And so I just try to say, "Oh, praise the Lord," and that's all I can say. That's all you can say. But it's just nicer if nobody says anything, right? Of course, then I'll probably be self-conscious. "Man, I guess I was really bad today." I don't know. See, that's the problem. There's too much of the speaker in it. There's too much. But I love Joseph. He's just like, it's not in me. It's not in me. But God will give you the interpretation. People ask me a lot of times, "Are you ready for service? Are you ready?" And I always say the same thing, no. Because how can I be ready? How could I be ready to do something that's impossible? What I have to do now, I'm ready to entertain. I'm ready to give a speech. I have notes. I'm ready to talk. I'm ready to stand up here and whatever. But I'm not ready to change hearts. I'm not ready to see people be born of the Spirit. I'm not ready for what I really want to see happen is I want to see God move. I'm not ready to make God move. Can I make God move? But God can do that work. And so when I come up here, or if you're cleaning a toilet, or if you're mopping the floor, or if you're teaching kids, or if you're whatever you're doing, it has to be by faith. You have to trust the Lord. I believe you're going to do this through me, God. I was in a meeting full of a bunch of pastors, and I was listening to a couple of pastors talk about, just their churches. Like, man, it just seems like every Sunday I start to talk and I just see the glaze go over everybody's eyes. I just thought, man, how sad would that be to have that experience every Sunday? But I think that honestly, if I think that I have anything to offer, that's what's going to happen. If I ever think that it's me, or I have to come up with something, or I have to be entertaining, and I can entertain and I can move people to tears if I can tell sad stories. But only God can change hearts. Only God has what people need. And so Joseph knew that, and so he told Pharaoh. Verse 17, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I stood by the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came after the poor. Now notice how he uses a lot more adjectives this time to describe these cows. Poor and very ugly and gaunt. Such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. So he really lays it on thick about these cows. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up or chewed up the first 7 of the fat cows. And when they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as in the beginning. So I awoke. And you'd think that if they swallowed a whole cow, they would be plump and fat, but they were just as ugly and emaciated as before. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up out of this one stalk full and good. Then behold, 7 heads withered, thin and blight, by the east wind sprang up after them, and the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. And then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of the Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, this is really interesting because if you remember, way back when, and this is so important to realize that Joseph, way back when he was a kid, had, 2 dreams, remember? And those 2 dreams meant the same thing, right? That his brothers would one day bow down to him. And then the second dream was like the first dream. The first one was with the stalks of wheat, which is similar in a sense. There's wheat in the dream. But the second one was the stars and the moon and the sun would bow down to his star, and his father interpreted it saying, Will your brothers and your mother and I bow down to you? And he rebuked him. But Joseph believed that dream. He believed that one day, and probably as a young man and very full of pride and himself, thought, well, someday I'm going to be great. And my brothers are all going to bow down to me. And it didn't bother him telling them all that, right? And that shows where his heart was as a young man. But he believed it. Even after he was sold into Egypt, even after he was accused falsely, even after he was thrown into prison. How do we know that he believed it? Because with confidence, he told the chief butler and the chief baker, God can interpret your dreams, and his dreams will be sure, or his interpretation will be sure. He believed that God would give them the answer to their dreams, and which proves that he still believed God was going to answer and fulfill his dreams as a young man. And so when he stands before Pharaoh once again to interpret a dream, again, 2 dreams that are the same. 2 dreams, he would say, God has an interpretation for you. He still believed at that moment when he's standing before Pharaoh, and he's probably thinking to himself, don't we do that? We figure, this is how God's going to do it. We believe God's going to do something, and we're like, okay, this is what God's going to do. I prayed for provision, and this is how God's going to do it. So we go out to our mailbox and look. It's not there. And I bet you anything, if you could get into Joseph's head at this moment, he was standing before Pharaoh, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to tell him what his dream is, and he's going to let me go home. Finally. He's just going to say, okay, I'm sending you back home. That's all he wanted, was to go home, right? He just wanted to be free from being a slave, wanted to be free from being in prison. It's probably what he dreamed about every day. What happens next is going to blow his mind, but it's going to make so much sense with everything. It says, Joseph said to Pharaoh, verse 25, the dreams of the Pharaoh are one, meaning they're the same. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blight by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to the Pharaoh. God has shown the Pharaoh what he is about to do. And so he tells him, this is the interpretation of the dream. Now, this isn't obvious. Now, it might be a little bit, okay, that makes a lot of sense, because before the 3 vines were 3 days, and the 3 baskets were 3 days. And so 3 times 7, maybe, but still, it's years, days. Obviously, this is something that the Lord, it's not some formula that Joseph is using, it's something that the Lord is giving to him. And he says, verse 29, indeed 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. In other words, there's going to be plump cows and lots of wheat the first 7 years, but after that, all the cows and all the wheat are going to be devoured by the gaunt and blighted land. So, verse 31, the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream, this is important, the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Okay, so what did he just tell them? He says, you had the same dream, 2 different dreams, but they were the same, and it was repeated twice. Why? Because it's going to happen. In other words, it could be, if you only had it once, this is something that might happen if you don't act. Right? But since you had it twice, it proves that God is going to do it for sure. What does that tell us about what Joseph knew about his dream? Happened twice, it's going to happen for sure. So Joseph believes God. And that's the beautiful thing about this. It shows us just from the way that he talks to the chief butler, the chief baker, and to Pharaoh, that he believed that God was going to bring his dream to pass too. So he's going to shortly bring it to pass. Verse 33, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. So pretty bold. He's like, okay, this is the dream, and this is also part of the dream. And this is what he's saying. Let Pharaoh select a discerning wise man. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Now, how can 1/5 supply for the next 7 years when they're going to have, 4/5 during the years of plenty? One thing I've learned, just traveling the world a little bit, going to India, it's amazing what they eat. They usually have 2 meals a day. They eat one meal of rice, and 1 meal of rice and chicken, usually, or some kind of meat, and the meat is probably about 3 ounces. And that's what they eat. Now, you think about what we eat as Americans, probably 5 times that much, pretty easily. They say that when you go to a house in India, they will cook you a big meal, and the food that they're setting before you, and this is so important, if you ever go to India, you need to know this. The food that they set before you is probably the food that they will be eating on for the next whole week. You, as an American, will easily be able to eat all of it in one sitting. And so, you have to be very careful. So they're going to put a small portion on your plate. If you clear that plate, they will fill it again. So how do you keep them from filling it again? Because you don't want to eat all their food. You leave a little bit. You eat a portion, you leave a little bit, and they won't fill your plate again. But if you clean it, they'll fill it. And so you have to know how to work the system, because if you don't work, I mean, they'll just keep filling your plate, and you're thinking, oh, well, I got to eat it because they put it before me, right? That's what you'd think as an American. And so here they're going to have 7 years. Now, what do we know about how people eat in times of plenty? We've probably all lived in times mostly of plenty. And maybe some of us have had times in our life where we had less food, and that was tough for us. And maybe even because of that, we eat more now than we should. I kind of have that a little bit. I remember when I was a kid, my mom was a single mom, me and my sister. She didn't make a lot of money. Sometimes groceries were sparse, and we went without a little bit. And because of that, I have a psychological problem that I think I need to eat whatever I can whenever I can get it. That's why I avoid all-you-can-eat buffets, because I would be a lot bigger than I already am. But, that's the thing. When you're used to plenty, you just eat and eat and eat because there's plenty, right? But then when there's famine, you can get by on a lot less food. And so 1/5 is going to be plenty for the people to eat for the next 7 years. And of course, they'll ration it. And of course, in times of famine, they ration things. So he says, what verse was I on? In verse 37? So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? And that's an interesting phrase. He recognizes that in Joseph, and this isn't a guy who worshipped the God of the Hebrews, right? This is a guy who worshipped the pantheon of Egypt. Apis and Horus and all these different gods that they worship there in Egypt, Isis and all those other gods. And so it's interesting, here he is, acknowledging this guy has the Spirit of the living God in him. How could we find somebody, and I don't know if he said this in front of all of them or if they had a sidebar or what, but he says, I don't think we can find anybody like this. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Talk about a promotion. He goes from the highest in the prison, which, is prestigious, I suppose, in the prison, but now the highest in all the land of Egypt. In fact, nobody is greater than Joseph except for Pharaoh himself. Now, if you think about it, and you probably heard Joseph is a type of Christ, maybe you've heard that. But here's Joseph who is humbled to the point of a servant and then became a prisoner in the lowest pit, in this guy's life, and then exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh. And so too, Jesus would humble himself, not consider it to be robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, becoming a servant, humbling himself in the likeness of man, even to the point of death, and God has highly exalted him. And so we see a picture of what Jesus would be in in Joseph himself. And what is amazing is through this prophecy that Joseph gives, or the interpretation of this dream, and then the wisdom that's imparted afterwards and being exalted to the highest place, Joseph will become the Savior of the world. Right? He saves the entire world from death because of famine. And God would use Joseph specifically to save the children of Israel, or his brothers who betrayed him and his father, so that God would preserve the line of the Messiah. If Joseph wouldn't have gone through all of that, and I'm sure Joseph didn't feel this while he was in prison, but if Joseph hadn't have gone through all of that, none of us would be here tonight. None of us would have a Savior. None of us would know Jesus, because all of the children of Israel would have died. They found a woman's tomb who, she was, I can't remember what country it was in, But they found inside the tomb, it's pretty amazing archaeological find. Inside the tomb, they found all this, it was a very opulent tomb with all kinds of jewelry and beautiful adornments. And in the tomb was an inscription that she had written, and it said, there was a great famine in the land. I sent my chief servant to Joseph, but he never returned. I sent my next servant to Joseph, and with prizes, with silver to trade for grain, basically trade straight across bags of silver for grain, and they would not trade. And she says, and so I die here with all of my possessions. And it was pretty amazing, but she names Joseph specifically in that inscription. Joseph would save, the children of Israel would save, but many people would still die because the famine was so severe. And so it says, then Pharaoh took his signet, verse 42, ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him with garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And so he gives him all the trappings. Can you imagine? He's wearing prison clothes, or probably rags the day before, and now he's there. They put the signet on his hand, which is basically the Pharaoh's signature. He could basically say what he wanted, and it would be done. And verse 43, and he had him ride in the second chariot. This is like Air Force Two, right? It's like the second chariot, the limousine of their day, which he had. And he cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And so the priest of On would have been over. On was in Hierapolis, in those, what is currently Hierapolis, that area. And basically the priest of On was the highest priest of the Egyptian gods in their time. And so he's given this prestigious wife, political prowess, given the name Zaphnath-Paneah, meaning that God hears and answers. And that's kind of the idea behind Joseph's name. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Interesting, Jesus was 30 years old when he started his public ministry. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city food of the fields which surrounded them. And Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. So you can see it was very, very plentiful. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of the famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. Now he gives it a Hebrew name, and the name means made to forget. And the idea behind that is what he says next: for God has made me forget all my toil and all my all my father's house. And so basically, the joy of the birth of his son, the blessing of the exaltation that Joseph's received, has basically made him forget all the pain that he's been through in his life. And the name of the second was called Ephraim, for God had caused me to be fruitful. God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And verse 53, then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt, or the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said, and the famine was in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, go to Joseph, whatever he says to you do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the lands. And so basically what it was a drought. And, what they can tell from the histories of the writings of the land of Egypt was that the drought would, they expected every year during the monsoon season that the Nile River would flood. And when it flooded, they had all these irrigation canals, much like we do. We store up water in the wet season and it runs through the canals, and they did the same thing. The river would flood and it would go off into these little tributaries that they'd made, and it would go and water all their crops. Well, they had 7 years where basically the rain didn't hit the Sudan and run down the Nile River, and because they'd only get a couple inches of rain a year in Egypt itself, but the Nile was kind of the lifeblood. And so the 7 years of plenty would be great, flooding of the Nile, which would cause lots of water to expand fields and make more crops. The more water that came down, the more ditches they could dig, the more land they could water. But then the 7 years of famine, no flooding, no water, cows died, grain was sparse, and people were in trouble. And so God would use this circumstance, not only to save the world, but also to bring ultimately the children of Israel into fruitfulness. And so we'll see that as we carry on forward. Let's pray.